The day was calm and delightful. The two boys scampered about the boat like cats, rapidly unfurling and raising the sails whenever there was a whisper of wind, then lowering them again, starting the engine, and falling asleep whenever the wind died. For once there was nothing we had to do and nothing we could do, so we lounged around on the deck, watching the sea go by, watching the crested terns and sea eagles that flew over us, and watching the flying fish that swarmed occasionally around the boat. The 3 chickens sat in the prow of the boat and watched us. One of the more disturbing aspects of travel in remote areas is the necessity of taking your food with you in non-perishable form. For Westerners who are used to getting their chickens wrapped in polythene from the supermarket, it is an uncomfortable experience to share a long ride on a small boat with 3 live chickens who are eyeing you with a deep and dreadful suspicion which you are in no position to allay. Despite the fact that an Indonesian island chicken has probably had a much more natural and pleasant life than one raised on a battery farm in England, people who wouldn't think twice about buying something oven-ready become much more upset about a chicken that they've been on a boat with, so there is probably buried in the Western psyche a deep taboo about eating anything you've been introduced to socially. As it happened, we would not be eating all 3 of them ourselves. Whichever god it is in the complicated Hindu pantheon who has the lowly task of determining the fate of chickens was obviously in a rumbustious mood that day and was planning a little havoc of his own. And then at last the island of Comodo was ahead of us, creeping slowly towards us from the horizon. The colour of the sea around the boat was changing from the heavy, inky black it had been for the last few hours to a much lighter, translucent blue, but the island itself seemed, perhaps to our impressionable senses, to be a dark and sombre mass looming over the water. As it approached, its gloomy form gradually resolved into great serrated heaps of rocks, and behind them heavy, undulating hills. Closer still, we could begin to make out the details of the vegetation. There were palm trees, but in meagre numbers. They were stuck sporadically across the brows of the hills, as if the island had spines, or as if someone had chucked little darts into the hills. It reminded me of the illustration from Gulliver's Travels, in which Gulliver has been tethered to the ground by the Lilliputians, and has dozens of tiny Lilliputian spears sticking into him. The images that the island presented to the imagination were very hard to avoid. The rocky outcrops took on the shape of massive triangular teeth, and the dark and moody grey-brown hills undulated like the heavy folds of a lizard's skin. I knew that if I were a mariner in unknown waters, the first thing I would write on my charts at this moment would be, "Here be dragons." But the harder I looked at the island as it crept past our starboard bow, and the harder I tried to filter out the promptings of a suggestible imagination, the more the images nevertheless insisted themselves upon me. The ridge of a hill that stretched in a thick folding shape down into the water, heavily wrinkled round its folds, had the contours of a lizard's leg. Not in the actual shape, of course, but in the natural interplay of its contours and in the heavy thickness of its textures. This was the first time that I had such an impression, but several times during the subsequent trips that we made during this year, the same feeling crept up on me. Each new type of terrain we encountered in different parts of the world would seem to have a particular palette of colours, textures, shapes and contours, which made it characteristically itself. And the forms of life that you would find in that terrain would often seem to be drawn from that same distinctive palette. There are obvious mechanisms we know about to account for some of this, of course. For many creatures, camouflage is a survival mechanism, and evolution will select in its favour. But the scale on which these intuited, perhaps half-imagined correspondences seem to occur is much larger and more general than that. We are currently beginning to arrive at a lot of new ideas about the way that shapes emerge in nature. And it is not impossible to imagine that, as we discover more about fractal geometry, the strange attractors which lie at the heart of newly emerging theories of chaos, and the way in which the mathematics of growth and erosion interact, we may discover that these apparent echoes of shape and texture are not entirely fanciful or coincidental. Maybe. I suggested something along these lines to Mark, and he said I was being absurd. Since he was looking at exactly the same landscape as I was, I have to allow that it might all simply have been my imagination, half-baked as it was in the Indonesian sun. We moored at a long, rickety wooden jetty that stuck out from the middle of a wide, pale beach. At the landward end, the jetty was surmounted by an archway, nailed to the top of which was a wooden board which welcomed us to Comodo, and therefore served slightly to diminish our sense of intrepidness. The moment we passed under the archway, there was suddenly a strong smell. You had to go through it to get the smell. Until you'd been through the archway, you hadn't arrived, and you didn't get the strong, thick, musty smell of Comodo. The next blow to our sense of intrepidness was the rather neatly laid-out path. This led from the end of the jetty, parallel to the shore, towards the next and major blow to our sense of intrepidness, which was a visitors' village. This was a group of fairly ramshackle wooden buildings, an administration centre from which the island, which is a wildlife reserve, is run, a cafeteria terrace, and a small museum. Behind these, ranged around the inside of a steep, semicircular slope, were about half a dozen visitors' huts, on stilts. It was about lunchtime, and there were nearly a dozen people sitting in the cafeteria eating noodles and drinking 7-Up. Americans, Dutch, you name it. Where had they come from? How had they got here? What was going on? Outside the administration hut was a wooden sign with regulations all over it, such as Report to National Park Office. Travel outside visitor centre only with guards. Wear pants and shoes, and watch for snakes. Lying on the ground under this was a small stuffed dragon. I say small because it was only about 4 feet long. It had been modelled in a completely spread-eagled posture, lying flat on the ground, with its forelimbs stretched out in front, and its back limbs lying alongside its long, tapering tail. I was a little startled to see it for a moment, but then went up to have a look at it. It opened its eyes and had a look at me. I rocketed backwards with a yell of astonishment which provoked barks of derisive laughter from the terrace. "It's just a dragon," called out an American girl. I went over. "Have you been here long?" I asked. "Oh, hours," she said. "We came over on the ferry from Labuan Bajo. Done the dragons, boarded them. The food's terrible." "What ferry?" I asked. "Oh, comes over most days." Oh, I see. From Labuan Bajo. "You have to go and sign the visitors' book in the office," she said, pointing at it. Rather ruffled, I went and joined Mark and Gaynor. "This isn't at all what I expected," said Mark, standing there in the middle of our pile of intrepid baggage, holding the 3 chickens. "Did we need to bring these?" he asked Kiri. Kiri said it was always a good idea to bring chickens for the kitchen. Otherwise we just have to eat fish and noodles. "I think I prefer fish," said Gaynor. Kiri explained that she was wrong, and that she preferred chicken to fish. Westerners, he explained, preferred chicken. It was well known. Fish was only cheap food for peasants. We would be eating chicken, which was sexy and which we preferred. He took the chickens, which were tethered together with a long piece of string, put them down by our baggage, and ushered us up the steps to the park office, where one of the park guards gave us forms and a pencil. Just as we were starting to fill them in, giving details of our passport numbers, date, country and town of birth,